To my immediate right is Liz Crane, who is the Deputy Director of ArtPlace America. Now, ArtPlace America, yes. Did clap? Yeah, sure. That's fine. That's fine. I don't think it's going to help the chance. Now, ArtPlace America is a consortium of what is about 14 funders, government agencies that have come together to support creative placemaking itself. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is, from a funder's perspective, is what makes creative placemaking, the funding for creative placemaking, different from funding traditionally for the arts. Now, at the center here is somebody that all of us in Jersey should know. Nick Paleologos is the Executive Director of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. And this is the state agency that provides primary support to the arts, and as you know, at no cost to taxpayers, because all the money comes from hotel motel tax. That's how the arts are funding, and there's not enough of that, but hopefully we'll have more soon. To farthest right is another gentleman that you should all know, Chris Daggett, who's the president and CEO of the Dodge Foundation. Now, the Dodge Foundation is one of the more progressive foundations, and I would say one of the earliest foundations in making the connection between arts and community and economic development and sustainability. So their work really connects the pieces. And I do hope that there are a number of funders in New Jersey, around the country, that have dockets for arts and community and economic development. And I hope more of them follow in the path of the Dodge Foundation and find connections among those dockets, among those sources of funding. So before we start, why don't we give each a round of applause. We're going to save a little room at the end. Nick has a little presentation that he wants to show you, but we'll go just straight into it. It's going to be a conversation. Well, why don't we go ahead and start? So why don't we just start by talking about examples of creative placemaking initiatives that you think of, that you funded, that you think of as real models for creative placemaking. And if you can talk a little bit about how it's different from a creative placemaking context than, let's say, a traditional funding for the arts. Why don't we start with Liz, and then we'll go down to Liz.
And I will take probably just like 2 minutes to lay out a little bit of the framework as far as how we even think about creative placemaking, because it has been evolving over time. As Leo said, we are a collaboration of foundations. We have been grant making for the past 3 years. We've done about $42 million in grants over those 3 years. We are about to announce another about $14.5 million next week, so it's very exciting. And over that time, we've been trying to learn and evolve along with the field. I think this work has been going on for a really long time, since the dawn of civilization, but certainly very heavily with sort of similar frameworks over the last 20 years or so. And the creative placemaking then has become a term to try to wrap a number of different types of things together. And I think as we try to simplify down how we think about creative placemaking, we have been talking about it lately as really anything where you're doing art to change a place. So arts-based interventions with place-based outcomes. And I think there's been a lot of other definitions that come about. We're not using that as a definition per se, but I think it's a really good shorthand way to understand what we're talking about. And I think another common misconception that I want to sort of dispel, and then I'll give you a couple of examples. When we talk about creative placemaking, we mean it where creative is actually an adverb and not an adjective. So what I mean by that is in creative placemaking, it's the making that's creative. So instead of making places creative, you're making places creatively. It's a really fine sort of shift, but this notion of making, this process that goes into creative placemaking with the arts sort of at the core and as the driver of that process, is really what we're interested in with this sort of any range and a large range of place-based outcomes that can result from that. So I'll name two examples just to sort of try to illustrate what I mean by that. One is sort of a classic example that many of you may be familiar with, which is the Springboard for the Arts Irrigate project out in St. Paul. So St. Paul just had a new light rail line open up. I think like literally last week, the Green Line finally opened in St. Paul. And they had a few years of really intense construction that were happening along the line, and a lot of big disruption to communities. So what Springboard did, knowing that with these disruptions, people stopped coming to the neighborhood, instead of going to this Walgreens, they're going to that Walgreens, and that the narrative that happens when there are these big disruptions tends to be really negative. They decided they wanted to use the arts and artists and their relationships with artists to help sort of alleviate some of this disruption. So they trained a large number of artists to do sort of these light touch place-based interventions, and then they paired those artists with local businesses. So, over here you had, face painting in a storefront. Over here you had something happening in an alleyway next to a building. A pop-up performance at night, a big art project using the windows of the businesses. And what they found is that in doing that, they were actually both creating a destination while the neighborhood was under construction, so people had a reason to come to this neighborhood, and also drumming up support so that when the light rail actually opened in the neighborhood, people were already accustomed to coming to this neighborhood. And they measured this by looking at essentially the equivalent of sort of a Google News search, looking at how many times was the neighborhood, the name of the neighborhood associated with horrible traffic and terrible disruption versus how many times was this associated with, really fun thing to do on Friday. So I think that type of, the artists paired with the local businesses, that was the arts-based intervention. The context was this new light rail opening in this neighborhood that was going to be severely disrupted. And then the outcomes was really this change in narrative from what could have been if they hadn't sort of created this excitement around the line. So I think that's one example that sort of neatly pairs the context, the arts intervention, and then these sort of place-based outcomes and this intention of place-based outcomes. One other project, because we feel very strongly that rural creative placemaking is just as interesting as urban and neighborhood creative placemaking. One of my, and I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I do really love this project up in Prattsville, New York. So the town of Prattsville was severely devastated by Hurricane Irene, and after they started considering how are we going to rebuild ourselves, the anecdote I heard was that the next town over was how do we rebuild ourselves to be as great as we were, and this town was like, how do we rebuild ourselves to be better? And part of the way that they're doing this is they have put in the center of this little main street downtown, they're constructing an art center that will both serve as a community center, a resource, a sort of pivot point for conversations about the future of the community. And they're also bringing in artist residencies to bring in artists to actually help design and think about what the community will look like and feel like using their sort of creative processes. And that project, I think, to me, marries some really interesting elements with this sort of resiliency strategy with the idea of an anchor, the arts organization serving as this community anchor for dialogue, and then also this sort of arts engaged and community engaged design process that's actually happening using the community. So to me, I think again, we've got the context, we've got this interesting sort of Hurricane Irene opportunity, we've got the arts-based intervention, which is the development of this art center and the artist residencies, and then we've got the place-based outcomes, which is ultimately to rebuild the community both physically, socially, and economically, so that it can thrive in the future. So that was more than 2 minutes.
No, that's great. Thanks. Nick?
Leo is actually our investment, so I think he threw us a softball. Originally through Arts Build Communities in Rutgers and now through PlanSmart, but let me just back up from that. And this will be, for those of you who are in the arts community, this is the time to check your cell phone, look your emails. This will be for everybody else because our constituents have heard this a gazillion times. But when you think about the State Council on the Arts as a funder, and we are in fact the largest funder of arts organizations and artists in New Jersey, and the third largest in the country, actually. New Jersey is number 3. All or most of our funding goes directly to nonprofit arts organizations or individual artists. The notion of creative placemaking is something that New Jersey was involved in a quarter of a century ago before they even had a name for it. And in fact, the person, although this is in no way a reflection on her time and service, who's responsible for creative placemaking in our office is Paula Stevens. So if you need any... Paula is our expert in that area. 93% of the money that we award every year is to artists and arts organizations, and those artists and arts organizations are really at the heart of community revitalization in so many respects. And so that other sliver. Oh, the other thing I want to mention, because it's not just council staff that's been committed to the notion of creative placemaking, but it's been the council itself. And the council doesn't just award the money and forget about it. The council shows up. They show up all the time. They were here today, and I see Joyce Gore from our council is here this afternoon, and Marilyn Dorr was here this morning along with Sharon Burton Turner. But I want to say something especially about Joyce, because not only is she here, and she's staying for the whole day, but she dragged her daughter, Ayana, to this, who's being very patient as well. So, hi, Ayana, and hi, Joyce. The sliver of our budget that's devoted to projects like Leo's is so small that the impact that we can have can only be felt if it's leveraging other activity, whether it's non-governmental funders or private funders. And so when we started thinking about creative placemaking, we tried to ask ourselves the question, how can the council be most useful to our constituents to help them make the case to you, to the rest of the world, to the planners, to the citizens, to the non-arts oriented folks who every single day, as you probably heard from Jim Kennedy a little bit earlier, get on the train, go to work, come back, and want to go someplace. They want to go out. They want to go to a restaurant, a jazz club. They want to see theater. They want to listen to music. They don't call it art. It's fun. It lifts their spirits. It makes their life worth living. It makes our life worth living. Jim happened to come I came here from Massachusetts, so the very first time I went up to Rahway, I had no idea. When I used to tell other people I went to Rahway, they say, "Oh, the prison." I thought, I didn't even know there was a prison there. I met Jim outside UC PAC, and he told me the story, which I'm sure he probably told you this morning, of how a town that was so wonderfully placed, there it is, 15 minutes from Penn Station, New York, the train station is there. The state, by the way, invested a ton of money, to upgrade that train station, and they took a little slice of it due to another state program, the public art program, to make it really cool. And Jim realized that, this is a great place for people to live, and I'm going to make it even better, because sure, they're here because it's an easy commute. Sure, they're here because it's reasonably priced. But if I'm going to keep people here, and I'm going to make them want to stay here and invest here and buy things here, I need to develop UC PAC and renovate it. I need to build the Hamilton stage. I need to make that downtown into something where that ultimately is a destination. Who would have thought? But that's a story that Jim can tell, and we can't put Jim in our pocket and take him around. I wish we could. I wish we could take Jane Golden with us to every meeting, to talk to every citizen in the state of New Jersey, and just say, talk to her for 3 minutes and then you'll get it. Okay? We can't do that. And so we thought, well, what can we do? And what we could do with the modest amount of money that we had was to create a way of telling Jim's story and Newark's story and Red Bank's story and Millville's story, and in a 2 or 2.5 minute video, and put it on a map of New Jersey along with a lot of other useful information so that our community can speak to the public at large, can speak to their funders, and tell the story about creative placemaking and a lot of other things as well. But what I'll show you at the at the end is just one of the pin videos. We call them pin videos, which is essentially a commercial for creative placemaking, and we're creating them thanks to Chris Daggett and the Dodge Foundation, which is the second largest funder of the arts in the state of New Jersey. And when we had the conversation around the table at the State Arts Council, just to give you an idea of how these things happen, we're sitting there thinking, how much is this going to cost to make these videos? We'd love to do it. We'd love to make it available to people. Well, it's going to cost X. Well, we only have X minus, 25,000. Chris, I have 10 minutes. I literally got in the car and drove up to Motown, his headquarters in Morristown, and sat with Laura and Chris and said, listen, this is what we want to do, and we're trying to communicate to people who aren't necessarily artists, who aren't arts organizations, but who love and benefit from what we do, but don't realize it, or don't realize it as much as they should. And fortunately for us, Chris said okay, and the videos that you're going to see, or the one video that I'll show you at the end, is really because these guys stepped up. So it was a marriage of a governmental funder and a non-governmental funder to try and create a tool to let artists speak to citizens about the value of creative placemaking.
Thank you. Chris?
That was just Leo's first question. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. First, let me just start by saying that just as the first session ended, my wife Bea and I, Bea's at the paper mill, and as we were coming out, we got asked to join Jane Golden for lunch. So, in case you were wondering, she is as energetic and wired up at lunch as she was on that speech. She is a force of nature, I think. But so, let me talk about just a couple things. And for those of you who don't know, and most of you certainly know the Dodge Foundation, but I don't know how many know overall what we're involved in. Our 4 areas of focus are arts, education, the environment, and media. We give away about $12 million a year, 3 of which is in, or $3 million each in each of arts, education, and the environment, and then about $600,000 or $700,000 in media, and then we have our poetry program, which I think many of you are familiar with, and I'm hoping you will all come to the Poetry Festival. This is an on year, so October 23rd through 6th, did I add the dates right? I think that's what it is. And in our education docket, and I think as many of you know, in our arts docket, we support arts programs throughout New Jersey, from Cape May to Sussex and to the Jersey Shore. And on our education budget, about $2 million of the 3 goes to arts education. So when all is said and done, we do about $5 million a year overall in arts. And as Nick said, we're the second largest supporter of the arts behind New Jersey State Council of the Arts. Our work in arts and creative placemaking, in my view, the way I look at it anyway, is focused on 2 things that you have to think about at the same time. One is community, because without community, you really can't have a robust arts program. And secondly, economic development, because arts can be, as we've seen in a number of places, a driver for economic development. So for us, thinking about creative placemaking is not just thinking about art. but it's thinking much more broadly about how you deal with developing community. And of course, in addition to the creative placemaking grants we've made, such as in Millville and in Orange and in Newark and in Rahway, and to some degree in Patterson with the Great Falls National Park now, trying to help out a little bit there, and then in Monmouth and Morris counties. We also do it through our activities in community development, or community building, if you will, through Creative New Jersey, which I think many of you have participated in. If you haven't been to one of the community or Creative New Jersey events yet, where is Liz Murphy? Where are you? There you are, Liz. If you haven't been to one of those events yet, you've missed out, because you really should, even if it's not in your community, you should go to one just to see the amount of energy that develops in the course of a day, talking about how you can use creativity to turn around a community. And the second, of course, is our efforts in Sustainable Jersey. The Sustainable Jersey program. Is Donna Drew still here? Donna, you there? And if you combine that kind of work that's being done in Sustainable Jersey and Creative New Jersey, along with some of the work that we're doing also in media, which is all about how you use information to help in building community, you put all that together, then you can really talk about creative placemaking. But it has to be in that context, I think, that is well beyond the arts. So we can get into some of the details, I think, as we go in the conversation, but at least it lays a little bit of groundwork, I think, for each of the three of us as to how we, in our respective organizations, look at creative placemaking.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. Liz, actually, you brought up the issue of rural areas, and we've heard about cities like Newark, Jersey City, and some of the more urban areas. But it'd be interesting. I'm sure there's people from various different communities here. How do you, as funders, think about creative placemaking in different types of areas, cities, suburbs, small towns, rural areas?
So since I brought it up, I'll start with that. I think when a lot of folks started talking about creative placemaking, in many ways it felt like a very urban-based conversation. Here's another sort of community development or downtown sort of revitalization kind of strategy. And I think that's certainly a really big piece of it. But there's a lot of interesting potential for these same types of strategies or sort of variations on these strategies to function really well in both suburban and in rural and small town areas. So, I think when we talk about, I brought up the sort of context of the place, and I think I want to sort of keep honing in on that, because a lot of times we get really focused on the sort of tactics of creative placemaking, or the sort of strategies to some degree, without sort of addressing the fact that usually when we're working in a place, it has its own unique cauldron of challenges and opportunities to take advantage of. So, I think in a downtown area, you're much more focused on the sort of destination aspect of it, the people out on the street, the what is there to do, what is there to sort of see, how are people moving around. That sort of vibrancy question becomes really relevant, I think, in a sort of downtown area. When you get into neighborhoods, there's a much sort of deeper and more connected strategy, or connections strategy, I should say, where it is sometimes about attracting people, and it's sometimes about connecting people to a sense of place. It's sometimes about taking assets and sort of, leveraging them and bringing them up to the forefront, providing new opportunities and new sort of cultural experiences and that kind of thing. When you start moving into small towns or rural areas, there's a lot of interesting questions around how do you literally create a new market in a rural place, a new economy when the economy is sort of struggling. And I think we've seen a lot of interesting regional strategies in more rural areas that we're playing around with the term serial linked placemaking, although, but with the idea that, there's places, there's a region that has some set of qualities or culture, and then there's individual places that all have their own identities and assets. And how do you both highlight, these sort of individual places, these individual rural towns, but also create a regional strategy that can function more comprehensively for those towns, and then link them in a way that gets people going from one to the other. So that's a sort of example of how, you know, creative placemaking is different. But there is a metaphor there, I think, too, into a neighborhood or urban area where you might have an arts organization here, something else to do here, something else to do here, and people just don't go in between those things, and that's where that sort of connecting piece. So I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but I think thinking about that context and thinking about what is it that you're trying to do in any given particular place becomes really important to creating a strategy that actually has a chance of being successful.
And before I move on to Chris and then and Nick, are there things that what kind of things, just to follow up, what kind of things do you look for from applicants that let you know, okay, they really understand that sense of place?
So we've asked questions in our LOI in the past. You know, I think our questions are sort of constantly shifting and maybe shifting again in the future, but we do want to understand what is the portfolio of strategies that other folks are actually working on in a community, so that if you're coming in with a creative placemaking strategy, it is both cognizant of and intentional around what else is happening and what the sort of common vision is or the set of strategies that are going on. So we do look very closely to see if somebody seems to really understand the context of the place and the particular challenges that that place faces and who else is working on those challenges. And it doesn't mean that the project needs to directly align, sort of line up with and drive towards those things, but we wanted to see an intentionality behind why you are diverging from it. You know, so if you think that the strategies are taking the community in this direction, and part of your strategy is, but we want to create better connections with the community because this strategy doesn't seem to be doing that, then that's great. Then we hear that and we understand how your sort of arts-based strategy relates to the broader set of strategies that are happening, or the broader sort of context. So, you know, I think in our full application this time, we actually asked people to delve much more deeply into what is this place, what is the effect that you're trying to have on this place, and then how are you going to know if you've had that effect.
Okay, thanks. Chris and then Nick.
So, you asked, I think, sort of the core questions, what's the difference between urban, rural, and suburban possibly? To me, there's not a whole lot of difference in the sense that a lot of urban areas are basically a bunch of neighborhoods. And some of the work that's best done there starts at a neighborhood level, and then other neighborhoods might catch on. You may or may not catch on and do and similar things. But I think if you look at the work again of Jane Golden in Philadelphia, there was a lot of, you know, neighborhood by neighborhood activity. But urban areas may have a greater economic base from which to build and to draw upon, and that would be a distinction that you might see that maybe makes them have a little bit of a stronger chance. But at the same time, I keep falling back to this concept of community. In the end, you can get things started by, actually I'm the one who didn't turn off my cell phone, sorry. That's why I make sure it's a very simple two-step, right? So of course I've lost my train of thought where I was going
about community.
Yeah, that it come back to the concept of community, because you can get started with an effort in creative placemaking with an art angle, but in the end you're going to need buy-in from the government at some point in time, because you want a supportive government of your activities, and you saw that again with Jane's work in Philadelphia. She had great support from the city. You need support. You need to create something where the community doesn't want to see you fail. So they will provide, and it doesn't have to be always financial support. It can be support in a wide range of areas, in-kind services and other sorts of things. But that's the key to it eventually, is that no matter where you start, whether it's from art or whether it's from some environmental activity, whatever the starting point is for creative placemaking and creative work and reimagining your community, ultimately you need to get buy-in from the entire community across the board. So again, not a whole lot of differences in the three areas, but urban may be a little bit of an economic boost because they maybe have a basic support, but in the end it's got to be community-wide.
Okay, I want to go back. My next question is going to be about how do you tell, how do you know when there is buy-in? But first I want to let Nick answer the question about the issue of different types of places.
Well, I mean, I think Chris put his finger on it. The video that I'm going to show you later is not from a town that you would expect. It's not Newark, although we have one for Newark. It's not Red Bank. It's South Orange. It's not South Orange. It's the latest one that we did, and it's a little town in South Jersey called Hamilton. Now, I mean, who would have thunk that Hamilton was fertile ground for creative placemaking? But it is. And part of that gets me to a larger point, which is, I mentioned a little bit earlier about the council's longstanding commitment. The reason why New Jersey is so fertile, and the reason why towns like Hamilton can envision it, is it comes back to people. You need to energize individuals, and then individuals bring others to the cause. Jane Golden is a great example of that. But here in New Jersey, the council has had a long-standing relationship with Art Pride, the Art Pride New Jersey Foundation. I saw Anne Marie here earlier, and I see Karen Pinzola here. I can't emphasize enough how where we are today in the area of creative placemaking is a tribute to the work, quiet, unheralded work that they've been doing for decades. And in Karen's case, when I first got here 3 years ago and received an education on what ArtPlace New Jersey is, I was amazed that this grassroots effort that began back in the early 90s, that involved thousands of people across multi-sectors in a statewide conversation led by the governor at the time on how we can integrate the arts into all these other sectors, healthcare, education, the issues of access. Many of the initiatives that exist today grew out of careful planting of seeds, cultivating those seeds over time, and then creating advocates all over the state in areas. And it's those advocates, whether they're in a city or in a suburb or in a rural community, they become the foundation around which your creative place grows. So we're lucky. Not every state has an Art Pride. Not every state has a Karen or an Anne Marie. But the successes that we see now across the state are due in large part to the forward thinking of the council back then in cooperation with the folks at Art Pride.
And can we just give a round of applause for Art Pride?
Really quickly, because I mean, I think one thing that we talk about a lot, as far as this idea of how do you get art integrated into all of these strategies, how do you, every time you have a conversation about community, alongside health, education, transportation, there's arts and culture bringing something to the table of value. I think it's because arts and culture is everywhere. Unlike, a light rail line or like, a waterfront or some of these building blocks that we think of when we have a lot of sort of common revitalization strategies, arts and culture is literally everywhere. And this sort of, from the rural sort of civic pride and the kind of events that happen on that scale to these sort of downtown large scale arts institutions. So understanding how to leverage that and what is that sort of unique value that the arts can bring. For us has been a really interesting way and compelling way to talk to people and sort of get them on board with that notion that it's not that arts just need to be at the table because they're valuable, because they are, but because they are everywhere and they're an asset for everyone to sort of consider and think about and strategize with and around.
Let's come back to that. I do want to, before I forget, go back to something that Chris said about the buy-in. And I'll just say this: when I started my career as a fundraiser, when I started one of my careers as a fundraiser at a community development corporation about 10 years ago, and of course we'd have to do grants proposals where we'd have to show partnerships. It was, well, write a letter for this other agency, tell them how much they love us, and then we'll put that in. So let me ask you, as funders, how do you tell the difference between one of those type of letters and that there's a real partnership going on?
You ask questions. And a lot of questions, and then you check on the answers if you have to, but basically you want to see evidence of collaboration, evidence of the fact that you thought through what you're doing, evidence of the fact that you've gotten some community involvement, at least if you're talking about creative placemaking. So it's the due diligence side of things, frankly. All the letters can be great, but and the more the merrier, I suppose, in some respects, from a wider variety of people. But you really do need to just keep asking those questions.
I have an easy answer to that. We don't accept letters. We don't, and part of our LOI process, we don't, and just to sort of, we have an LOI short application that then goes into a finalist application. In our short application, we don't, or our final one, we don't actually accept letters. But what we do that I think is probably one of the most valuable things, and has resulted in, I think, a really interesting ongoing dialogue with our grantees is we do a site visit as a part of the full applications phase. So when you're actually on the ground and talking to people, and whether or not they actually have all those partners in the room, because honestly when there's 20 people in the room, it's not always as valuable as just having a few good partners in the room. But I think you get a sense of when this group is walking down the street, do they know people? You know what I mean? Are people coming out? Are they able to sort of have conversations? Are they, tone sensitive or tone deaf to what's actually happening around them? And then who are these other entities and what is the actual role that they're playing? Because I think it's all fine and good to put a letter of support in, but what we want to understand is, do you understand what that group is doing, and do you understand what this project is doing, and how they either relate or align or leverage all those fun buzzwords that we like to use.
And I want to be clear, we don't accept letters in that sense either. I mean, we have a very formal process that does not include letter writing, but that isn't to say when people write to you about something, you don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, well, I guess we get letters too. We get letters. I think, all of the above. One of the things that we try and do as much as we can is to get out to organizations, kick the tires, see what's going on. We do have a more formal process, maybe 3 times a year. We dedicate a day to what we call constituent meetings, in which council members will stay in Trenton for the entire day, and we'll bring in 4 or 5, maybe 6 organizations. And I will say that it certainly sends a strong message to the council members as funders when organizations show up with a couple of board members, a couple of community folks, the executive director. When an entourage comes in, that in and of itself tells us that there's a group there that care enough to take a half a day and come to Trenton to present their case or give us a progress report. Whereas, if it's just the executive director by him or herself, that speaks volumes.
Going back to something that Liz was saying about you want to see that applicants have an understanding of sense of place and the role of that arts can play in making that place better. I mean, without saying, okay, this is the language I would specifically want to see. What do you look for to tell you, okay, they really do get it, and it's not just they're looking to just fund their arts project?
I think to me it comes in that intersection between the description of the place that's been provided and the set of activities and project that's being proposed. Because I think there's also, we see some situations where there's a great description of all of the social and economic and history of the community and all the challenges and opportunities, and then the project doesn't speak to that at all. And then in that situation, I'm like, great, I'm so glad that you really understand the history of this community, and I don't know what this project is doing to actually respond to that and to sort of push it in some way or move the dial on some element of that. So I think, it's hard to say, what is the exact language, but I think that sense that there's a connection between, here's the type of place we're in, is this a community that's, you know, fairly disinvested? Is this a community that's at a tipping point? There's some stirrings here and there, but, you know, this project is about pushing it over that point. Is it a community where there's a lot going on, but there's some sense of disconnect, or there's some sense of conversation or meaning making? You know, I think Jane brought that up, that sort of sense of meaning that's missing. You know, we want to understand, what is it about this strategy that's going to address, you know, realistically the context of a place. If you're in a disinvested place, to imagine that, you know, one strategy is going to fundamentally, you know, change the community in a way that's, you know, without being connected to other strategies, I think is challenging. But to understand that sort of catalytic power in a disinvested neighborhood versus like a tipping point power, that's when we start getting really excited that this strategy, you know, could have some legs.
So I went to see this movie about 2 weeks ago. It was called $1 Million Arm. Has anybody seen it?
Yeah.
No? Very popular. Oh, sorry. So it was a Disney movie, and it was about these kids who play cricket in India who eventually get a major league contract with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And if you've gone to the movie, or you've seen this movie about 1 million times, this Disney movie. So you've seen it about soccer, you've seen it about football, you've seen it about baseball, and it was wonderful. John Hamm was in it, Asif Manvi. It was great. There was nothing unexpected about it. It was satisfying. You know, it was fine. This is like that. If you're sitting on the funder side of the table, and the usual suspects come in and they say the usual things, you say, well, I guess that's great. Seems to be going well. On the other hand, if you're sitting on the funder side of the table and something unexpected happens, or something unusual, or you get a validation about a project or a grantee that comes out of left field, somebody who has nothing to do with the arts, somebody whose life was changed by whatever the arts organization or the artist in question was doing, well, you know, that gets our attention. And it's something that we remember. And it's something, because it stands up, because it's so memorable, it's something we repeat over and over and over to everyone we meet for the next 6 months. So to the extent that you're able to find validators, find supporters who will convey the essence of what you're doing and the value of what you're doing, but they're not you as the artists or the arts organizations, then I think it's infinitely better.
I'm not sure I'd add a whole lot to what's been said. I mean, I think they've both Liz and Nick have hit key points. And I don't know that I could say that we at Dodge, and maybe Laura, you'll push back against this, but I don't know that we formally have a creative placemaking program per se where we invite formal proposals around creative placemaking. I think it's evolving as we're getting proposals that come in from places like Rahway and Orange and Millville, and it makes us start to think, okay, how should we do this more intentionally than we're doing now? And I suspect that will evolve quite a bit over time, particularly as you see more and more efforts to collaborate, because as people collaborate on projects, you think more broadly about it in a community sense.
Sure. And just to be clear, I'm sorry if I created the impression that you have creative placement docket. What I meant, what I was saying is that in terms of connecting the various dockets because there are funders, and I'm not going to mention any names, but that do have similar dockets, but have not made those connections, that they fund arts or they fund environment or something like that.
We spend an enormous amount of time working what we call cross-docket activity, to the point even, it's interesting, the program directors at Dodge all review applications across the different dockets. So, for example, an arts project may come in and not get reviewed this time by Laura, but will be reviewed by Margaret Waldock or Molly Diaguiar on the environment and media side, because we believe that cross-docket work is important for their own work in their dockets. And I'm surprised continually the number of times I go to meetings of other funders where people don't even know what the people in the other dockets are doing, let alone talk with them about a project. They literally don't have a conversation. They're in their silos and they don't go across those silos. That happens more in the funding community than you would like to acknowledge or would like to know. But we need to continually push people to think across dockets in whatever area of funding they're doing. I don't care if it's healthcare, working with some community development activity and nothing to do with the arts. It needs to be more of that kind of thinking in the foundation community than exists today.
Yeah.
I just said amen. No, I mean, I think one of the most interesting, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think one of the most interesting things about ArtPlace's formation was that it was the presidents of the foundations that were involved in that conversation who, by nature, see across sectors and see that, you know, it's not just the arts that are leading this, but it's how the arts integrate with all of these other priorities that they have. Which has been great to allow us to like sort of live and explore that hybrid space in a way that some other foundations with more silos have challenges doing. And it's not always the program officer's fault either, as you all know. You know, it's sometimes just literally the structure of the foundation that makes that challenging.
Now, are the foundations, this is a question specifically for Liz, are the foundations that you've been working with, are they, have they had their own challenges in trying to
I think every foundation functions differently, and I think we've got some really great cross-sector folks on our foundation teams that work together. I mean, you know, Kresge Foundation is doing amazing work in integrating all of their portfolios, you know, and all of them I think have, particularly because they tend to work at this sort of very national level, they tend to have a broad spectrum, you know, but you do sometimes see things with the arts, you know, program here and the community development program here where you just, if they talk together more, you know, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities for collaboration and interesting opportunities for the sort of case making for how their respective agendas and sort of projects can actually help achieve each other's goals. But, you know, it's really any organization. It's not just foundations that have that problem, I think.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. And why don't do we have microphones here or
I
not?
think we can hear, but we'll
Okay,
take them.
we can hear. Why don't since we started this way, why don't I start this way and then go that way? Jim,
Yeah.
do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm Jim Hickey. I'm director of the Local Arts Corridor Partnership in Monmouth County. And I'd like to refer back to Liz's reference to serial linked partnerships across regions. And I wonder if you, and it was a very good explanation you gave us for that, but I wonder if you might have an example of a regional collaboration, a regional creative placemaking effort that successfully address the individual characteristics within the region while addressing the overall regional strategy at the same time.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have some exciting ones that'll be public next week. I was going to say if you actually, but if you look through the finalists, which are public and listed, you know, there's actually I think a few of those in some of our rural projects that were in that portfolio. You know, and we've had sort of other regional projects. You know, I think the Worm Farm Institute one, which has a sort of center around Fermentation Fest in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, but then also works with farmers around a whole region to do these sort of roadside culture stands and other interesting partnering artists and farmers together. You know, and I'm trying to think, you know, I think we've been moving in a direction that allows more for some of those regional activities, although the way our grant making program is structured, you have to sort of overcome some challenges to get that through because we tend to focus very specifically on one place, the way that it's sort of structured. So we don't fund as much like field building or broad sort of agendas. We did fund the state of Connecticut to do a series of vacant storefront projects in a number of different towns that have sort of linked that together. That was in our 2013 portfolio, so that might be one to look at too.
And Nick, I mean, you fund the counties.
Yeah, we have, if you think of our budget as a pie, 75% of the money that we grant out goes directly to mostly organizations and individual artists. But of the remaining 25%, half of it goes to a local arts program that is anchored in the counties. So every one of New Jersey's 21 counties, cultural and heritage organizations gets a grant from the council, and they develop, as Jim was talking about, Monmouth, one of our all-stars, and the whole MoCo corridor thing is brilliant. But they have relative freedom with regard to the council grant that goes to the county cultural heritage organization.
And are there any guidelines or conversations about how do you, thinking about like a place like Monmouth County, which has places like Red Bank and Asbury Park, which are obviously great destinations, but how do you make sure that other places like Belmar or Matawan or Colts Neck get their a fair share?
Well, there is an elaborate process and formula that's evolved over the last decade and a half for how the county cultural and heritage grants are awarded. In fact, we're this year, we're at the top of a 3-year cycle for our county cultural and heritage organizations. Now, in addition to, I should say, the grant that will go to Monmouth Arts, the organizations that you mentioned also file applications directly with the council. So they're getting GOS GPS support in addition to the monies that are going to the county cultural organization.
Okay.
I should also say, parenthetically, that in terms of cross-sector partnerships, probably the most well-developed and mature one that we have is in education. I mean, we're growing partnerships in healthcare and access and community development, but we make a requirement of our GOS GPS grants that our grantees make an effort to connect with schools and school systems. So that really is the most mature and well-developed.
Good, thanks. Chris, did you want to? Okay, I think we have in the front here. Yes.
It sounds, Lynn, like your program's a relatively new program, but I was wondering if any of the panelists have any experience or evidence about the duration of programs in relation to impact.
Do you want to be a little more specific? Duration?
So like for creative placemaking, it's a 1-year grant versus a 2-year, 3-year grant, have more impact in a community.
So we don't give multi-year grants. Although we have organizations we funded for 30 straight years. So, but it's actually part of that's a quirk of the accounting world. If we make a commitment for a 3-year grant, we have to book the entire 3 years of the grant in the first year. So we do either renewable grants or we'll talk to people about longer term grants, but we tell them from the beginning, this is a 1-year grant. You're welcome to come back, and we would encourage you to come back. And we've talked to you about coming back, but we can't commit to you today. And then on the other end, our focus has been on excellence in whatever areas we're working in, and we fund people. We like to think they're at the top of their respective areas in terms of the quality of work that they do. And that's partly why you see some organizations that year after year after year will get a Dodge grant.
And I think, I think it's interesting that you bring up that sort of excellence focus. I think we at ArtPlace, because of the way we're structured, we also, at the moment, I think our grants are 18 months. They're 18 months. Although we are going to have a new grant program starting some point in the next year where we have longer term grants for 5 places, but it's not sort of at the scale of our national grant making program. And I think a lot of it depends on the type of strategy that you're employing, whether it is sort of a temporary intervention type strategy or if it's a long-term development type strategy. They have different time horizons, they have different types of impacts. So it's hard to sort of say writ large whether, certainly longer term funded things have more of a time to mature and create relationships. But we do see ourselves really as more of an experimental funder or risk-taking funder, where we're looking to fund sort of delegates and ambassadors to the field, new models, people that are coming in with new partners and new ideas, and trying new things, as opposed to funding the group that's been doing something amazing for the last 30 years, and we want to continue funding it because they're doing good things. It's just the way we're structured. We're also a time-bound organization, so we are going to sunset. So we are a 10-year initiative. We've been funding for 3 years. We're about to fund our 4th round, and then we have 6 more rounds of being in existence. So for us, that funding with that field-based expansion catalyzing model in mind to try new models is very different than funding sort of over a long-term investment with a long-term relationship with our set of grantees.
I'd like to just go back, changing the topic a bit, but going back to a conversation that came up partly this morning, and again here, talking about Art Pride. In order for us to be successful in developing a creative, any kind of creative placemaking or anything along that line, we have to get people generally to have a better appreciation for arts, not just for art's sake, but for the value of arts in economic development, for the value of arts in education. As you know, when people cut education budgets, it's usually arts that go first. And fortunately in New Jersey, we have some requirements in arts at the K-12 level that are part of our required state standards that are helpful, but you have to keep building that. And part of that is the work of Art Pride and the work that they're doing, not just in advocacy work at the state level, which they've done a terrific job over the years, but it's at the community level, getting the local mayors, getting freeholders, getting everybody at every level. And then as an extension of that, we have to take that and think about not only when we're doing economic development, thinking about providing support for arts, but also, as was raised this morning, artists. We have to figure out a way to support artists, not only in buying their works, if they're producing some kind of works, but also housing. The kinds of things that make them an integral part of a community and not some group that comes in from somewhere else and then because they can't afford to live in that community. So we've got to partner with some of the organizations, not only in the affordable housing side, but also some of the arts organizations that devote their time and energies to arts, to providing housing for artists. So this, when we talk about art, placemaking, we have to think about, in creative placemaking, we have to think about all these aspects of it. We can't just be thinking about organizations and how to get some organizations started.
Right. Thank you. Nick, you want to?
Nope.
I think we have time for one more question. We were over here. Okay, yes, you got your hand. Yes.
This speaks to the issue of leveraging that you've all addressed, and also the cross-sector conversations, maybe what you're talking about right now, Chris. But as funders, especially with State Arts Council, it's about leveraging, and I wonder, and I know it is with ArtPlace America, it's about kind of galvanizing all these private foundations. I wonder what has been done and what may be done in the future about partnerships that are non-traditional in terms of the philanthropy arena with affordable housing. In the city, in New York City, there's the EDC that has been doing some RFPs and whatnot. But that's where the government as well as private foundations have power. It's not about funding. It's not about the dollars that are going out, but perhaps tapping sources that individual arts organizations cannot leverage at all from where they are.
So, give it to you from my perspective. Yeah. We have $12 million is a lot of money to give away each year, but it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the need. And $16 million that Nick does, drop in the bucket in terms of the need. And all the good work that ArtPlace is now doing. So, at Dodge, we're blessed with a corpus of some getting close to $300 million again, which sounds like a lot of money, but look at some of these other foundations across the country with billions of dollars in their corpus. So if I told you the amount of time that I have spent personally fundraising, you'd be surprised because I don't have to raise a dollar to do anything. But I take the attitude that if we're making an investment, and I see every single grant Dodge makes as an investment. We're investing in an entity of some kind. That if I'm going to make that investment, and you have a foundation that has an interest in that general area, I'm going to be on the phone with my counterpart saying, boy, I got a project you ought to get involved in. And as a result of that, we've brought in quite a lot of money to projects in all of our program areas from outside, some of which is national money that we're bringing. But we also need to do a better job of connecting with communities. One of our board members just yesterday at our board meeting of the foundation talked about whether we should, when we make some of these grants to arts, require a municipal match. Now that doesn't make sense. I mean, municipalities don't have the money to do that, but I like the kind of thinking that is into that, which is how do you create other and new collaborations with funders, and sometimes from funding areas that you don't necessarily think of as traditional ones, to constantly be thinking, how can we talk about collaborating all the time. We tell you all to collaborate. We're lousy at collaborating. We really are. And I kid people all the time telling people that the hardest part about collaboration is collaborating. Because there's boards that have their quirks, and there's staffs that have their quirks, and everybody's got a quirk, and you got to get around it somehow. So I spend a lot of my time trying to get around that and to constantly thinking about what are new ways, new people I can talk with. I cold call people. I don't care. If I have something I've invested in, I am committed to that organization in a way that says, don't just use us to write checks. Help us dream and figure out new ways to do that. And I think we all have to do that more and more in the funding community, just as we've asked all of you to do that in the grantee community.
Yeah, and I want to, and I was trying to keep my intro short, but I want to actually sort of go back to why ArtPlace even exists. And it's not so that funders can sort of pool money and have us give it out and not have to think about it, and whatever. We exist because foundations realize that if they came together and funded through this model, they could not only do a lot of sort of learning and case making, but they could then leverage new types of investments and new types of partnerships in that cross-sector space, which they have less. Some of them are doing it a little bit on their own, but when they have that sort of collective power, that's what they're able to do. So the notion of this 10-year initiative is to have these foundations come together. Our first 3 years was primarily about grant making. We are now very explicitly moving into the field building zone of things, and as a part of that, I like to call it our infiltration strategy, which is really understanding what is that unique value proposition that the arts brings to community change agendas, because there are unique things that the arts bring. This is not, I think people think about things like economic impact, and that's different from economic development, right? Economic impact is what's there. Economic development is how do you create something new and how do you push something forward. And it's not just about economic development. It's about social cohesion. It's about resiliency. It's about quality of life. All of these things. And the arts have a really distinct and unique role to play in this. So by coming together, these foundations are able to go out and demonstrate that. So some of the things that we're doing is really looking at how our funds line up with other federal investments like HUD investments or Tiger, DOT Tiger, things like that. And trying to make sure that when we have those opportunities to show, look, this initiative is going right alongside yours and it's actually enhancing what you're doing. This arts-based strategy is taking this housing project and it's actually maximizing the investment that you're making in this housing project. That's where I think our greatest opportunity as a collaboration of funders and as a field builder sort of lies.
Okay, thank you, because we want to give Nick a few minutes.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay.
I'll show the video if you want.
But I want to just thank Liz and Nick and Chris